just need to cut the hard line to the mainframe, and I'm in.
It's a double chair.
A digital
Double chair. Who's there?
It's Brandon.
Welcome, everyone interested in this ancient text called the Bible, written thousands of years ago, and yet they say it's supposed to mean something to us today. And in order for us to understand what it means to us today, we're going to try and understand what it meant to them back then when it was originally written. Today, we have a digital double chair for you, and we are graced with the presence of...
Brandon Pollock.
Brandon Pollock, my friend from like 15 years ago. I think we did math. It was like a good long while.
Yeah.
But we went to college and we parted ways as life has its, ups and downs and takes you different places. But the Lord saw fit to reconnect us. And we are going to be talking about what today?
Genesis 16, the awesome story of Hagar.
Yeah.
And the importance of El Roy.
Ah, yes, Elroy, one of the many names attributed to God. The Bible is about to get very real. We might get a little bit colorful, so buckle up and welcome to Dumb Christian. Brandon, before we get into Genesis chapter 16 and take a look at this Egyptian princess, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so as you alluded to, we met in college a decade and a half ago. Been married 13 years to my lovely wife, Lauren. We have two daughters, a 9-year-old coming up next week and a 5-year-old. And we live just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. And we have a good life. I professionally am a voice actor and narrate audiobooks, do commercials and stuff like that. So, but yeah, no, it's... I worked in radio for 12 years and commuted. Our town's about 40 minutes north of Charlotte, so I decided to work for myself, and it's been probably the best decision I've ever made. So yeah.
That's pretty rad, man.
Yeah, man.
But when we reconnected and we were just kind of like talking about scripture and this story in particular, there was a reason why this story is so important to you. Without giving a spoiler of what we're about to get into, explain to us why this story is so important to you.
So I lost my father in 2019, November of 2019. And then, of course, we all went through the pandemic the year after that. And I think I'm speaking for myself, but maybe, you or anyone else can identify with this, but there was a sense of loneliness and a sense of, just so much that happened during that year. And so after losing my dad, and then going through that, and spiritually, I was coming from, I've always understood God. I've always believed in Jesus, and I've always had a personal relationship. It's gone up and down. It's taken on different names, as all relationships do. But I feel like, a couple years before Dad died, he was getting sick, and he told me that he was going to die soon. And I was like, oh, my gosh, Dad, I'm not ready to hear that. And that really kind of centralized my life and kind of shifted things for me. So long story short, spiritually going through losing Dad, the depression, the grief, going through the pandemic, starting to work for myself, I was in a very lonely place, And so I kind of felt like no one sees me. I kind of felt like I'm doing all this, I'm being a father, a husband, I'm making all these decisions and choices, and yet I feel like I'm just so alone, and I don't have my dad to call and say, Dad, this is how I feel. What do I do? And he was always kind of that ground, he was the closest resemblance of God's love, of God's wisdom, of God's voice in my life, an audible voice I could hear when he was here. So, it was that when I started doing a study of Genesis and read this, and it just blew my mind. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't have kids at this season in my life, but I can't imagine, like, especially losing your dad, pandemic, trying to figure out how to be husband, father, and then how do you even like respond to life when you feel like, man, I really screwed the pooch, right?
Yeah.
Now how do I? And it's got to feel extra like lonely and yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, you literally, those are all the questions you have to ask yourself. And I think as you go through life, everybody has to ask themselves those questions,
Yeah.
you know, through every season that you're going through. And so I just really, when I studied this and Hagar came into the picture, God blew my mind.
Yeah. So what does the name Elroy, what is it?
Elroy. Yeah. Elroy. Yeah, it's basically L-R-O-I. So
Okay.
like
so not
the return
Elroy
on investment,
Jetson,
I guess. Yeah,
not Elroy Jetson. Okay.
Yeah, Elroy. And
Okay.
so we could pick up the story as you know, you brilliantly have gone through with your awesome podcast, the Genesis story and Abram and Sarai and kind of what they've gone through up to this point. We know that God's promised Abraham a lineage and kids, and he's older in age, and then Abraham brings Sarai into the fold, right? That she's going to be part of this promise, obviously.
God brings her into
Sarah. Sorry, yes. God brings Sarai in, and so all these testaments and all these trials and tribulations that they go through, and traveling and journeying, and on that, you can kind of give some background because you did some research on how Hagar came to be.
Yeah. So, a couple chapters ago, we found that Abram and Sarai went to Egypt because there's a famine in the land of Canaan. While they were there, God protected miraculously and supernaturally Sarai from, having to do the horizontal mambo with Pharaoh and, whoever else was there trying to get a little, nookie. Yeah, there it is. But there was a particular Egyptian princess who saw how God protected Sarai, and she said, I would much rather be a servant in the house of Abram, serving that God who protects, the God who cares for his people, than be a mistress, because she wasn't like a high-up princess. She was just like one of the low, no-name princesses. And I'd much rather be in that house, part of that tribe, than just be a mistress to some other prince or some other douchebag that I don't really care about. So, when Abram and Sarai leave Egypt, when Pharaoh kicks them out, Hagar joins Abram's family, changes her name to Hagar, which means this is my life now. And she walks, we get a couple of chapters. The scripture doesn't tell us this, by the way. This is Jewish tradition. This is what the sages say where Hagar came from. And she's walking with this family as they return to Hebron. She sees Abram save his nephew Lot from war. She hears about the promise that God made Abram in the last chapter, chapter 15, and she's experiencing all the ways that God is taking care of this family. And then she's about to really be put in a terrible, horrible situation when Sarai and Abram want to believe God's promise that he's going to give them kids, a heritage, a lineage. But God doesn't explain how it's going to happen. So they think, just like when they went to Egypt on their own, there's a famine, let's figure out how to do this on our own. And then they screwed up there. Here, once again, God gives them a promise and they say, okay, well, let's figure out how to fulfill God's promise for him. And how do they do that?
So Sarai says, well, this is a beautiful lady that we have here, Hagar. Yeah. Why don't I give you her and you can, and she will give me a child. And
not just give you her. Why don't you guys bump uglies? That's what she's saying.
Yeah. You go. Okay. Yeah, you guys bump the uglies, and then the seed that is produced, I'll just take the kid, and that'll be God's promise.
Right.
So that was the plan. And Abram's like any other dude, like just follows the lead, like, all right, cool. Yeah, I'll do that. Great idea, honey.
Yeah, whatever you say, dear.
Yeah. So Hagar undoubtedly gets pregnant. Right. And then when she does, Sarai just immediately turns into an a-hole, basically. Like just an absolute jerk. Yeah. And so she goes to Abram and she says, hey, listen, the sight of her it despises me. Like, I get so mad. And Hagar,
because Hagar, once she became pregnant, we don't know like Hagar's feelings about the situation, except it does say that when she conceived, she looked on her mistress Sarai with contempt. So she started to like be like, haha, I can get pregnant, you can't.
Yeah.
And this just put Sarai over the edge.
Right. So to put it in perspective of 2022, let's say, for example, you have like a Real Housewives of, Bethsemane, or something. And like, okay, so you have
Right.
you have this wife and they're having trouble. So they go and get a surrogate mom. Like, let's just put it in 2022.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. And the surrogate mother comes in, but they don't have the technology to actually do it scientifically. So they bump the uglies. And then there's like these feelings. And then like the surrogate gets involved in this real, imagine putting a camera on that. Okay. Because the Bible, sometimes the Bible can talk about, literally decades can go by in 2 verses, right?
Right,
So
right.
Imagine living that day in and day out of this, contentment from Hagar to Sarai, Sarai to Hagar, and the jealousy and everything else. And, you would imagine it just gets to its boiling point. And so Sarai says, "Be gone with you," and kicks her out.
Right.
So Hagar is running for her life, getting away from this terrible, mean woman, and trying to figure out, like, okay, God, like, I was following you. I felt you lead me to this family, lead me to this place, and then now I'm here, right? And so we kind of pick up now in verse 7 of Genesis 16, and the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of the water in the wilderness. And so what I love about this is that the angel of the Lord found her. Okay,
Yes.
so she runs away from despair. She runs away from everything, and the angel of the Lord found her. Okay, and he said, "Hagar, Sarah's maid, you have come. Where have you come from, and where are you going?" And she said, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority." Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count." Then she said, "Behold, you are with child, and behold, your son shall be named Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction." And so it goes on to describe him that he will be like a wild donkey of a man, that he will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of his brothers. And so this begins so much of the world history. These few
Right.
verses just lays out literally a lot of what's still going on in the Middle East to this day. And
Yeah,
so,
like the Muslim population attribute their lineage to Ishmael. They come
Ishmael.
from. Yeah, so there's
100%.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and what I love about the Bible is that the Bible is confirmed through what we live and have, and history has recorded.
Right.
So when people say, the reason why this opened up my eyes is because I love history, right? I love science. And everything that I learn about history and science further proves
Right.
the incredibleness of our Creator, of
Yeah.
Yahweh, of Father God, right? And so the angel of the Lord found her in her despair, right?
Can we
And
just
then, go ahead?
on that for a second? Like that's so huge. I don't just want to gloss over that because, man, anybody ever feel like you're just walking through this constant like barrage of despair and hopelessness and this first little part of the story, this isn't even like the best part, but this is like, man, God seeks us out and he meets us where we're at in those like hopeless, fearful,
Right.
dark moments.
And
yeah.
and the beautiful part about this that really opened up my mind is that it's at all times, every day, every moment. And so, I think we as a society is still reeling from the effects of the last few years. I mean, especially here in America, right? We've had so much turmoil with vaccines and the pandemic and the politics and all this stuff. So here's what I advise anyone and everyone to separate what is all of that, right? Because a lot of times that can contribute to how we see God, right? How other people perceive God, how other people have reacted towards God can then become our description and feeling of God. And it's a false, you know what I mean? It's based on other people's actions versus our own experience with God.
Right.
And so I think that as a society, it's just, we got to realize that we may feel like we're the only one that believes what we believe. We're the only one that thinks how we think. No one understands where I'm coming from. I feel alone. I know I screwed up and all these different things. God, I don't know, maybe no one has this, whoever's listening to this is like, I don't even know God, like Yahweh. These things you talk about don't make sense to me. Well, what I would say is just know that God has found you, right?
Yeah.
No matter where you are. And so when he says the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water, we don't know if she was there for weeks, months. She could have been there for hours. So when you're in that season could be a temporary season. It could be a long-term season. And so there's in every aspect of life, God is always there and God has always found you. He's always, all you have to do is separate that cloudedness, if you will, and how other people perceive God, and for yourself, say, God, introduce yourself to me. And then we learn why that's important, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned like other people's perceptions on God influencing our ability to know God.
Yes.
What's really interesting here is that Hagar has left a family who is trying to pursue God, trying to follow God. And man, every other situation that we find themselves in, they're righteous before God. The New Testament even praises how righteous Abram was.
He's the father of the faith. He's the father of faith.
Right. And yet these godly people chose some actions that actually caused harm to someone. And I can't help but wonder if there's anyone listening who knows what that's like.
Yes, 100%. And so I think a lot of times people are sometimes even unwilling to open up the Bible because they just have this preconceived notion of like, they're just going to be full of judgment. The Bible, the only perfect being in that Bible is Jesus Christ, period.
Yeah.
End of subject. The Bible is full of imperfect people, right? Whose diversion of God's plan he perfected through them. So it doesn't matter where you've been, what you're doing, what you're going through. God knows it. He's experienced it with you, and he still chose to forgive you through his son. So when we read the Bible, and that's why I love your podcast, because you break it down in a way that, we've been in church our whole lives. So we've been around these stories, these conversations, but perhaps you've been agnostic or an atheist, or you've just not been near Christian. Like, I don't know, maybe, I don't know. But I hope that no matter what your previous experience with or thoughts on God are, that this opens up your mind to allow him to start talking to you a little bit more so that you can experience him. Because the Bible is full of imperfect people, and he literally takes the imperfections of Adam and perfects the ship, Abram. And guess what? He delivers a promise with each of these diversions. And so the world and history is full of nothing but mistakes and a perfect God somehow protecting and providing provision over all of us. And so we act like when we go through a pandemic, God's surprised by it. But he's but he's not. You know what I mean? And so,
or we walk through our own, some other form of brokenness or despair,
whatever it is.
Right. Maybe even some damage that we've caused ourselves. Like God still meets us by the water. Okay. Yes. And then what does she keep going?
So when the angel of the Lord basically keeps her up to date on what she's going through, God's like, okay, you didn't know you were part of my plan, but now you are.
Yes.
So
whoa.
Let me update you. See? Whoa. She blindly walked through that faith.
Okay.
The angel of the Lord found her and was like, all right, listen, you've done so good up to this point. Here's what's going to happen.
Yes.
Here's what's going on. Here's the update you've been asking for and you didn't know.
Right.
So he finishes, he'll be a donkey of the man, Ishmael. Very important character in history, not just Christian faith.
Right.
But then, so after that, verse 13, she says, then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her El Roy, which translated to, you are the God who sees, or you are the God who sees me, depending on the translation. For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? So basically, a couple things to break down there. He says, I know what you're going through. Go back and submit yourself to her authority, right? And so there's so many things here, but let's go down to El Roy, okay? When we talked earlier about going through the pandemic and going through isolation, grief, divorce, heartache, losing a parent, losing a family, whatever, a friend, like, and the thing is that in between those big life moments, right? Like, you'll always remember the day you lose a parent. You'll always remember the day something tragic and terrible happens globally, and whatever. But those are just timestamps on our life, right?
Okay.
It's the day in and day out where God still sees you. God knows exactly what you're going through. And see, what connected all this was for me is growing up in the church, I kind of felt like God was this like Zeus-like with a pitchfork, sitting there like, when I die, I'm going to go up there. He's like, you're going to hell, like
Right.
I am perfect and you are not. Like it was this angry, judgmental God. And the God that I now know is the complete opposite, right?
And that is this opposite God that you're discovering is the God of this
It's the
ancient
same God.
text. Yes.
The same God in the Old Testament. The same God in the Old Testament is the same God in the New Testament, and it's shown through Jesus Christ, right? So and I got chills thinking about it. So I studied this, and I'm like, oh my God, you are the God who sees, and at all times, you've been aware of every mistake that I made, why I made that mistake, why I felt like I had to, like, you know everything there is about me, and you still love me. And you're still perfecting me, and you're still making anew the mistake, the derailments I've made, you've corrected. And so what it gave me was the personal faith to lean on what God says about me, what God has done for me, right? And then I walk in his grace. And then it's through that I'm able to have relationships outside of that. Right. But if I'm basing my being, who I am as a person, my soul, my mind, my body, everything, who I am, what encompasses Brandon Pollock, right? If that's based on what others say about me, which for 30 years of my life it was, it's a colossal mess.
Right.
Because what you're doing is you're changing who you are. You're putting on a different layer of skin to appease whoever you are, whoever's around you, right? So maybe someone identifies with that as like a people pleaser, because that's a lot of who I was. And so if you identify with that personality type, you can find yourself sitting there like, oh my gosh, like, what do I believe? Why do I believe this?
And yet God is able to see through that, and he knows
exactly
who you are. He sees who you truly are.
Yes, he sees that confusion. He understands the psychological damage that you've gone through or that you've experienced, and he knows everything there is about you. And so what it gave me in the absence of my earthly father was an actual father.
Yeah.
Was someone who I knew, Yahweh God, that I could talk to any moment, any day. And I had a cousin after dad died that said, have you ever yelled at God? I was like, oh, I'm not going to yell at God. I don't want to be struck dead.
Right.
Like, are you stupid? And he's like, dude, God knows that you're pissed. God knows you don't understand. God knows you're mad at him. And the thing is that he's not sitting there saying, how dare you be mad at me, son?
Right.
Because that's a human jealousy, right? The alpha dog, right? That's a human component. That's a human emotion. God's above that. So he doesn't have this like egotistical, manly testosterone. God is God, and he's above any feeling that we could possibly encounter, right? So God sees that, and he's like, man, you humans,
How long do I have to put up with you?
Oh
But-
my gosh,
so-
when are you just going to believe? I mean,
Right,
honestly,
right.
it's the truth. Yeah.
So Hagar, there's something really incredible about just this whole story, because in the Bible, we've never heard of Hagar before, or should I say, we've never seen her before.
Yeah.
And the first time we meet this Egyptian, she's not even like, you're like, what does she have to do with God's plan? She's an Egyptian princess. She's not from Abraham, like where does she fit into the story? We meet her, and we've never seen her before. The first time we meet her, she declares something to be true about this God. And she names him El Roy. And why is that so significant that Hagar speaks this name about a quality of God?
Well, it's important because of multiple things. By this point in Genesis 16, in the time frame of our human existence, right, of Earth, This is hundreds of years into life. I mean, I don't know exactly, but we're talking a lot of life experienced up to Genesis 16.
Yeah, I think maybe like 2000-ish.
Okay. 2000. We're in the year. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Hagar was not part of the original promise. Like she's not the president of faith like Abram was, you know? And so she's the first recorded person in the Bible. God decided to make her the first person from a human experience, human mindset to explain who his character is, to explain God.
To put into words, wow, I've experienced this quality of God. You are a God who sees me.
That is the first character description of God. You are the God who sees me. So what we have to do is when we read the rest of the Bible is look through it from that lens, because the Bible is meant to talk to you specifically, right? Now it has so many purposes, and that's the beautiful thing about God. And I love you said it multiple times. The Bible is like a sci-fi thriller, and it just gets better, and it does. Like you could literally, it's amazing the things that happen in this.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, so when you think about that importance, that someone who has not been mentioned, has only been in existence in this Bible for 16 verses, basically. Right? Who has no prehistory, and we know Ishmael, but we don't know much more about Hagar after this. And she comes in and she drops this truth bomb. Listen, everyone else who feels like you're not part of God's promise, that you're not sitting, you're not on the, you're not this, you're not that. God is the God who sees you.
Right. I'm not part of the big plan. I'm not a big megachurch preacher. I'm not married to a pastor. I don't even have the books of the Bible memorized. Who am I in the grand scheme of God's plan? Well, guess what? God sees you and has when he meets us and he encounters us and he says, "Oh, by the way, this is how you fit into the grand scheme of things."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's incredible.
Wow.
It's absolutely incredible. And then, if you grew up in church, you heard these sayings like, when Jesus died, he thought of you, right? Mm-hmm. And all these things, but it becomes kind of cliche, and you're like, I mean, thanks God, but
right.
I really, I don't really feel that, right? But when you realize that God is the God who sees and knows everything of every person for history, billions and billions of souls, right?
Right.
All knowing, Alpha, Omega, God with us, the Holy Spirit, Jesus, and then he delivers his son, Jesus. And there's this really cool thing in Matthew 17 at the end of it. Him and the disciples are going to go pay a tax. And the city people are trying to catch Jesus in like a little fib. And they're like, Peter, does Jesus pay taxes? And Jesus is like, so cool. He's like, man, listen, does your king make you pay taxes or his sons? And the guy's like, me, not his sons. And he's like, so I'm exempt. So he drops this like, I'm the son of God. I'm God. I don't have to pay your tax, number one. Right. Number two, Peter, just so we don't offend them, catch some fish. The first fish you catch is going to have a shekel in it. Pay that. And it was enough tax to pay Peter's and Jesus's tax for the year. Mm-hmm. So what's crazy is you could look at that and be, oh, okay, another miracle by Jesus. Yeah, but see, it's not a miracle. He doesn't have to do any spiritual sayings. He doesn't have to take a wand. It just is. He knew that shekel was there. He knew every hand that ever touched the shekel. He knew the fish came by and ate the shekel, and the city of wherever, and he knows all things. Mm-hmm. And so when you identify that, so he made the claim to be God, then he proved it by seeing all things. And I literally was meditating on that one day. And I was praying to Jesus, and I'm like, God, this is so cool. And if that's the case, God, you transcend time. And I went deep into this meditation. I'm like, oh, this is really cool, God, And I had this vision of a drone coming around a mountain. And I saw Peter and John sitting on, looking over the Black Sea, and he's just sitting there. And all of a sudden, Jesus turns and looks at the camera. And I'm like, oh my God, did that just happen?
He looked right at me.
Yeah. And then I'm like, oh, wait a minute. If this is the case, in theory, God is the God who sees. He transcends time. It's not God knew that I would think of this in the year 2022.
God is the first person to break the fourth wall.
Yeah, that's what it's like. It is, and it's like, oh my God, it's so that was meditation, and it was something God gave me in that moment, and it was kind of like a cool vision, and it connected with me because it just reminded me of the fact that Jesus is God, and he does see all things and knows all things from the beginning of time to the end of time.
And he wants to press into those hurt places. He wants to do some healing. And so there's a couple of things that are part of this story that I think are, it's really encouraging to come to this realization, like, okay, God sees me in whatever brokenness I've experienced, in whatever brokenness I've caused. He sees me and he loves me and he has good things for me. But the story also says, Hagar, go back. Right? And so please hear me. I'm not saying God is going to just tell you to go back into an abusive, painful harm. He's not telling you to put yourself deliberately in a situation where you're going to be hurt for the sake of being hurt. But when he meets us by the water, he wants to do healing in those hurt places. And to do that, sometimes we're going to have to walk through those hurt places again. So in this context, he does say, go back and look, 2022, single mom can get an apartment, can get a couple jobs. That's great. But this wasn't the case. She was literally wandering in the desert. How is she going to take care of herself, her son, like all of these things? And so God says, look, this is the way that we're going to provide. We're going to raise. We're going to protect Ishmael, you and Ishmael. We're going to encounter Hagar and Ishmael a little bit later. But he says, look, we need to address this issue. So we're going to have to press in and do some healing here. The second thing that makes this a little bit difficult is if you're listening and maybe you've been the source of someone's hurt. Maybe you have been Abram or Sarai, where you were just trying to do your best to follow God. And man, we make mistakes. We make decisions that cause hurt and harm. And one of the really interesting things right here is Abram and Sarai are being held responsible for the damage that they caused. Hey, you need to let Hagar come back. You need to take care of her. That's yo baby. This it's your baby daddy. Whatever. Anyway.
Who that is? That's your baby daddy. Sorry, it's a great song. It's one of my favorite songs of all time.
But so there's this really interesting way that this part of the story ends, where it's Hagar. We need to move forward. We're going to need to address this hurt that's in your life. And hey, Abram, Sarai, we need to have you take responsibility for the damage that you caused. And look, it may not be a perfect relationship and may not be a full relationship ever again. But each of us have a responsibility to let God work in those areas of damage in our lives. And he sees us and meets us where we're at for the purpose of healing and restoration. And that doesn't mean, hey, I see you by the water and I'm just going to leave you there. No. To walk in wholeness and restoration means we have to walk through those things that have caused damage, or maybe the things that we've caused damage in others.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that a lot of times it's hard for us to accept the process, right?
Yeah.
And we try to rush it. And we try to, look at what Sarai and Abram did. Now, they tried to rush God's process, and they ended up getting Hagar pregnant, and then it led to a lot of division within the family. Now, God still used the plan and still did exactly what he said through everything. But whenever we don't have complete faith, right? And it's very hard for us when we have this instant gratification and the instant way to get things done in 2022 to wait on God.
Yeah.
But it's in the waiting that we can hear God. It's in those moments when you're by the water in despair that God knocks on your heart and your mind and your soul and says, hey, this is why you're here.
Yes.
This is what you're doing now, and this is what it's going to become.
Yeah.
And that peace that you get when you start to separate the clouded stuff that comes from man-made, created emotions and feelings and money and whatever the frustration is, right? And we trust in God, and we just say, I'm just going to listen to what Jesus said, treat my brother like I want to be treated, love one another, and just show God's grace, mercy, and love to others. I'm going to let him handle everything else. And trust me, he will. And so, but to get to that point, like you're talking about, I have such a heart for people who may be a little disenfranchised from, we've hit on it earlier, but who maybe don't have ever been open to the idea of God, maybe atheist, agnostic. I think that that's the brilliant part of your podcast, because we can sit here and say shit, and we know that, like, I'm not going to go to hell. But, like,
Right.
in the 80s, when growing up, if I had said shit, I would have thought I was going to hell.
Right.
And so I get it. And so the thing is that if I can understand where everyone's coming from and their viewpoint of God, not everyone, but I mean, if I can sit down with someone and have a conversation and they can tell me their experience and thoughts on God, and I can be like, okay, and try to see from their viewpoint, right? Know that if that's how you feel, that you don't believe God is real, that, all these Christian politicians, blah, 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 and they're, whatever. Separate what everyone else has said, done to you, right? And get to know the true God.
Yeah.
Right. Just because God isn't the God that you've created in your mind does not mean God's not real. God is very real, and he sees you and he finds you constantly. And all you have to do is just go to the water and be present and just ask God to speak to you, and he will.
Yeah. And as far as a couple of dumb Christians can take it, I think that is Genesis chapter 16.
Yeah.
With Hagar fleeing her mistress.
It's one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. Yeah.
Man, thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us your insight and your heart. And maybe we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. I look forward to keeping up with your success, Jonathan. I love you, man. I love you, DC.
We love you too, man. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah,
and
man.
we love you guys. We'll catch you later. So that was Brandon joining us from North Carolina as we look at Hagar and how God found her and saw her, just like he wants to find and see everyone, regardless of the despair, hopelessness, and hurt that we have walked through. Be sure to check us out on YouTube, Dumb Christian Podcast. We got exclusive content up there. Hit subscribe, like, ring the bell. Here comes the butler. I'm coming. I love you guys. Catch you later.